Hey there, everybody. Pete Pardo here from Sea of Tranquility. Welcome to another episode of In the Prog Seat, Tuesday night. Got a fun show for you planned today for all of you second wave of British progressive rock, I guess we're going to call this, sort of, right? So this is an idea that was brought to our attention by Mr. Porter down below. And with saying that, let's introduce everybody. Eric Porter from New York. We've got Luis Nasser from Chicago, but in Mexico right now. We've got Chad Hutchinson from Pennsylvania. We got another New Yorker and Chuck Alvarez. And then all the way from Scotland, the guy who stays up late for us every Tuesday night, Mr. Stephen Reed from the UK Connection. Happening, fellas?
Greetings.
What's up? So this concept, the album after the split, or the albums after the split, who did it better? So we all know in the late 80s, we had this very cool British prog rock act called Marillion, who had this very charismatic frontman from Scotland named Dedic Dick, otherwise known as
Fish.
Fesh. F-E-S-H. And, he decided that, he needed a break from the band. The success they were getting, I think at the time, was a little bit too much for him. And he probably wanted to go maybe some different directions. So he left the band, went out on his own. The band hired another singer to replace him by the name of Steve Hogarth. And both bands put out new albums, not that far removed from each other. We had from Fish, we had Vigil in a Wilderness of Mirrors. And then in the Marillion camp, we had Season's End. Both very fine albums. Interestingly enough, you don't always see that when you have the split of this magnitude, right? Yeah, you have both bands, both camps really knocking it out of the park. And I think I personally, I've seen many times over the years, the fan base kind of either follows one or the other, and people have varying degrees of opinions on the directions of each one. That's what we're going to talk about today. We're going to have everybody kind of take their turn looking at both of these albums, what we like about them, what we don't like about them, and who kind of came out on top on these first two albums after the split. So we're going to, because I know he's very closely tied to this band, these bands, and the singer, as far as like his personal preference go, because I've spent so much time with him over the years. Mr. Stephen Reed from Scotland is going to go first today and kind of give us his analysis of both albums and who he thinks did it better.
Well, you might regret putting me first, Peter, because I've brought show and tell. Okay, I've brought
okay.
Quite a lot of show and tell. Okay, because I was 15 in 1988 when Fish left Marillion, and this really the first time where a band that I loved had this kind of seismic shift in their lineup. Most of the other ones that we talk about on the channel really happened before I had a chance to get into the bands. So really, it was one of those things. I was excited to find out who it was going to be. It was going to be the new Marillion singer. Because when you're 15, you expect it to be a name that you know. And instead, we ended up with a guy called Steve Hogarth, who had been in the Europeans, okay? A very young Steve Hogarth, yeah, all right? Okay, which are nothing like Marillion. And he then went on to be in a band called How We Live. Okay, he's a little bit more recognisable here, okay? And neither of these acts really, although the fact that this album is called Dry Land will tell you that there's a connection there. None of this sounds like Marillion. It's very new wave, it's very pop, it's all right, it's nothing fantastic. He doesn't even really sing on all of it. So once I got over the devastation, I started to get excited about what was going to happen, who was going to release what was it going to sound like. So supposedly Fish had really things in the can quite early on, mid-89. But EMI didn't want Marillion and Fish going directly head-to-head in the charts to see who was going to come out on top. So Vigil was delayed. So the first thing that we got from either band on the 24th of August 1989 was Hooks in You by Marillion. Okay, so this was the first thing that we heard with H, as Hogarth has been known since, really. And I was totally flummoxed by this when it came out, because this sounds I mean, if Incommunicado from Clutching at Straws is not typical Marillion, this is a heavy rock by Marillion standards. It's a heavy metal song, you know? And I mean, you were like kind of going, okay, this guy can sing, but how on earth will he handle the catalogue? You know, so this got to number 30 in the UK singles charts, and it's got After Me on the B-side, which only in recent times have I discovered that it's actually on the CD version, because it wasn't on my vinyl version of the album, strangely enough. So that was a really odd introduction to the new version of Marillion, which would then go on to obviously give us the whole thing, Season's End. Okay, this got to number 7 in the UK album charts, which on the back of a number 1 and number 2 album, not bad, after all the change and a bit of mucking about with who was going to be their singer. And interestingly enough, I mean, not this one, but my mate bought this album the day it came out. And we both went to work that night. Okay, we were both at the same school, both worked in the same place. I had a locker, he did not. He asked me to keep this in my locker. So I said, yeah, of course can. And it never happened, but I got away early that night. Must have been quiet night, whatever it was. You can go home early, Stephen. Thanks very much. So I took Tony's copy of Season's End home and recorded it and listened to it before he ever got the chance to hear it. And he has never let me forget that. You know, it's one of those things that is brought up on a regular basis. But I took it to school from the next day, but there you go. So I was absolutely blown away by this when I first heard it. I mean, as I say, Hooks and You was just an odd opening. But really, the opening pair on the album, King of Sunset Town, which I adore, I think it's an underrated song in this band's catalogue, and then Easter, are just phenomenal. It really, I mean, Easter's a brilliant song. It's a great lyric, it's a great vocal, it's a tremendous guitar solo, and the two together are just outstanding. It was released as a single too, which I've obviously got. Picture disc and 7-inch, but what came first was The Uninvited Guest, which is not one of my favourites on the album. I like it, I don't love it. And it's interesting thinking about it, because the singles, I don't think, Easter came out after the album was out. They don't serve the album fantastically well, I don't think. But it's difficult because of the style of music and the length of the songs and various things like that to represent the album in that sense. Do you know? And interestingly, I mean, I'd forgotten all about it, but the version of the album I got is a nice little promo version. So I've got the press release that came out, which tells you that Steve Hogarth was on the verge of selling his house and was packing in the music business. And then all of a sudden was getting off to sing in Marillion or play keyboards with Matt Johnson from The. And they had a choice to make. Very dramatic. Here you go. And I have not read that for I don't know how many years. But realistically, I think it's a fantastic album. I absolutely love it. You've got so much good stuff on here. Hollywood Girl is just beautiful. Berlin is tremendous. I love the mood and the atmosphere of the space. It's a song that they, in my opinion, should play more. It's kind of set the tone for some of the Marillion stuff with H that's followed that. Start small, build it and make it bigger, till eventually you've got that crescendo that just, especially live, blows you away. And I saw them live on this tour. So I saw them in Glasgow on the Season's End tour. And Steve Hogarth admitted latterly that he was really nervous about that gig because he was in Fish territory, you know, and he's playing to a raucous Glasgow crowd. But he was brilliant. And it was the first time I saw the band, and they were just ridiculously good. So I was blown away by Season's End. Fish happened the other way round because he'd been asked to hold things back, or made to hold things back, I would guess. So I saw him live on the 23rd of October in 1989. So this is like 3 months before the album came out, and he played in Edinburgh. And it was just a week after State of Mind came out. Now, this is maybe the most Marillion thing, or Marillion-like thing on the album, because there's not much that sounds like Marillion on Vigil in the Wilderness of Mirrors, you know? So he played nearly all of the album. He didn't play A Gentleman's Excuse Me, and he didn't play Cliché. And the only things that we knew from the album were State of Mind and The Voyeur, I Like to Watch, which is the B-side of State of Mind. And interestingly, also not on the vinyl version of the album. EMI did exactly the same thing with both albums. They put it on the CD and the cassette. They did not put it on the vinyl. They stuck it on the B side of the single, strangely enough, you know? So it was a strange kind of thing going to see a guy who was launching a solo career, but you hadn't heard anything realistically of the new material. And he got to a stage in the gig where I think it was Punch and Judy he introduced, and there was a massive cheer went up, and he went, "Hey, it's the ones we know." And you could kind of feel it grate on him. He must have done that through the whole tour, because everybody went absolutely wild for the Marillion songs. And the Fish songs were kind of like, yeah, okay, that's nice. You know, because well, we don't know any of these, and you've played us 7 or 8 of them. It's quite a lot to take in on one night. And he's a big challenging chap, you know? So the next taste we got was Big Wedge. And that's the same again, it's like Hooks in You in many ways. This is a big brash kind of pop rock song with synth brass and big hooks, not what we'd anticipated at all. And it was kind of an odd thing again where you thought, well, that's not really the vibe I took away from the gig. But I was still really looking forward to the album coming out. But for me, at that stage, Vigil was a slow burn, because this was something to digest. And I know a lot of my friends who really were kind of like, I'm out. I don't get this. This is not like Marillion. It looks like Marillion more than the Marillion album does, but it doesn't sound like them. And it doesn't really, but it doesn't try to, and it doesn't pretend to. But at the same time, it really, once you got under its skin, it becomes an outstanding album. You've got The Company, which is a veiled comment on his departure from Marillion. It's a really great and considered sing-along song. Then you've got like that huge hook of Big Wedge to give you something completely different. State of Mind is more contained. Family Business, with its really serious lyrics centering on domestic abuse, it is a really clever song about an important topic. Closing both sides with a softie, A Gentleman's Excuse Me, and Cliche, it's an odd move. I mean, I really like both. They're really good. I mean, that's one of my favourite singles off air, I'm a Gentleman's Excuse Me. It's really, really good. There's a red one too. It's just such a great song, but it's an odd way to close out both sides in such an understated way, you know? But for me, it's the opener, Vigil, and it's View from the Hill. They are the masterpieces here, and they have stood the test of time remarkably well. And I still think they're amongst the best things that he's done outside of Marillion, for me personally. And when you see them live, they are phenomenal. And for those of us who like to do these things, you can also, I've just got the 2-disc version, there's also the deluxe box set that came out not long ago, where disc 2 gives you an idea of what might have been, because there are bits of songs, lyrics of songs that end up, some of it on Clutching at Straws from the time of some of these demos. Some of them go on Season's End. Some of them end up on Vigil. Some of them end up on Eternal Exile and Suits by Fish. Some end up on Holidays in Eden. It's a fascinating kind of gestation of what they were doing at this stage. None of it comes off the way that it did eventually, but it is demos that you're listening to, but it's a very interesting journey. And there are not many opportunities to peek into what a band is doing in that way, then watch it split, and still you get to hear some of these songs kind of completed. So after all of that diatribe, it's going to be no surprise to anybody that I find this really difficult. This whole entity is part of my musical DNA. I have carried these albums right from the days that they came out until now. I still listen to them both regularly, and it may sound like a lie, but it's not. I genuinely have never gone and listened to one and then listened to the other and thought, which do I prefer? To me, they're just two outstanding albums. But that's not the point of this show. So I am in a virtual arm lock here, and I'm going to be held to the floor until I choose an album. And I would tell you that genuinely 15, 20 minutes ago, I nearly changed my mind. That's how close it is, because there's nothing between them. But if you're going to force me, and you are going to force me, because that's the sort of horrible people that you all are,
What
right?
I do,
Okay, then I am going to tell you that by the slimmest margin, so slim that I can't even take my fingers apart, I'm going to go for Season's End. There you go.
See, there's a reason why I asked him to go first, because I knew
Good
he's
night,
been
good night,
struggling
everybody.
with this.
Good night.
Sorry.
Cool. Yeah, this I will say, and I'll say my thing at the end, but this was really hard, because you have two really great albums. Anyway, Chad, you're up.
Ditto. No, you're absolutely right. It is very hard. My little Marillion story stems actually the first time I saw them. I was in college, and a friend of mine was a big fan. I really didn't know much of it. He played me some songs, and the only thing I kind of sort of recognized was Kaylee. And he begged me, he goes, "Come on, I'll buy a ticket. I'll buy your ticket. I'll drive. I'll buy dinner." It's like, fine, I'll go. He couldn't get anybody else to go. It's fine, I'll go. So we go up, and it's the Chestnut Cabaret in Philadelphia, which is long closed now. And it's a small club. It was a good rock club at the time. And we got there a little bit late, so we're sort of in the back of the floor. This is just a club, no stands or anything. So we're in the back of the floor near the bar. And they come on and do their thing. I think maybe I remember King of Sunset Town opening it and being like, whoa, that was kind of a cool build. So they got my attention from the start. And then, things were good. And all of a sudden they got to Easter. And song starts off kind of slow, and all of a sudden the sing-along part happens. And everybody in the joint is singing it but me. And I have no idea what's going on. I'm going, whoa, what am I missing? So needless to say, well, before I go there, they also came on with their encore with Incommunicado, which hooked me right away. So I went home, or I should say back to the University of Delaware, went to Rainbow Records next door, and I bought Season's End, and I bought Holidays in Eden, and I bought Clutching at Straws. So I was in. But the two songs I remember from that show were definitely King of Sunset Town and Easter, and just blown away. So I got hooked into the Hogarth side pretty immediately. Later on, I went back and bought Fish material. Friend of mine said he thought Vigil at the time was his best, so I bought Vigil first. And honestly, until this, I haven't listened to it in years. And I was listening to it at the Shore this weekend, and it got down, I guess, the first 5 songs, and I was like, you know what? Not only do I still remember these songs, but they're all good. I've always loved Vigil. It's sort of a mini epic. It's got different parts. And he's got that great the answers to the questions that I'm asking you. I mean, just great stuff. I mean, you get that angst from him. There is a theme throughout it with a lot of the capitalism and big money and things like that. I always really actually did like Big Wedge. I know it's a completely different sound. It's got like you said, the big horn blasts and all that, but I think it's a fun song, as bitter as it is. The slow songs are nice. Gentlemen, excuse me, Cliche, which I think is probably the one that sounds most like Marillion, like one of the slower things that they do. There's not one on here I dislike. I'm looking at the list again now, and the Company, if you listen to it, it's pretty harsh at the time, knowing that he just split in this band. He's saying, raise your glass to me now, or whatever the line is. Just like, wow, that's pretty tough. When he's talking about the hill, he's halfway up, halfway down. He's just he's got a lot of anger going on there, but I understand. So you also talked about Vigil sounds a lot different than a Marillion album, and it really does, because he didn't write any of the music. He was the lyricist. So that's why he brought in a bunch of people to help him write the album, especially Mickey Simmons. So I think 4 or 5 of the songs, maybe actually most of the album is co-written with Mickey Simmons. He's got the ex-guitarist from Dire Straits on there, a drummer from Spandau Ballet. He wrote View from the Hill with one of the guitar players from Iron Maiden, which was just a really wild combination. But he also brought in all sorts of influences that he couldn't bring into Marillion. There's a lot of Celtic stuff going on. He's got the strings and the horns, and then the Company's got the pipes and the whistles and the accordion. that wasn't going to fit on a Marillion album ever. And so the album's very diverse. Sometimes when an album's too diverse, I kind of lose a little interest. There's a couple Queen albums out there. They get a little too weird in one direction, but they're very Queen in the rest of it. I shouldn't say very Queen. They're the Queen that I like more. But Vigil's a solid album. I think they're all well-crafted songs. There's bombast, there's calm, there's quiet, there's reflective, there's anger. I mean, it's got a little bit of everything. But then you have Season's End. And for me, Season's End, like Stephen, like you said, starting off the King of Sunset Town, just an awesome song with that build. And then you go into Easter. It's a 1-2 punch. And I remember Steve Hogarth, next time I saw them, introducing Easter as a love song to Ireland, which I always thought was a really cool way of describing the song. Uninvited Guest, even though it's a little commercial, I always like the lyrics. He's got all those goofy idioms in there. And maybe, Stephen, you can tell me what a 15-stone first footer is. I know 15 stone is a weight, but what's a first footer?
Well, at Hogmanay, so New Year, on Hogmanay in Scotland, it's a tradition to visit somebody just after the stroke of midnight, and the first person to set foot over your threshold is your first footer. So if you first foot someone, you're the first in the house in the new year.
Thank you. I appreciate that. I've been wondering that since 1991.
30 years in the making, right?
Yeah. Yeah, but this album has a great mood to it all the way through. I feel it has a consistency. Like you said, some of it comes from those demos. I hear parts of Berlin and Bell on the Sea and Easter and King of Sunset Town. And there's a lot of things floating in there. But once they went back and refined this with John Helmer's lyrics and more time in the studio, these songs really came together and it's a hell of a package from start to finish. There's highs and lows, but the real star, and if you were a Marillion fan at the time, like Stephen was, had to be blown away by Steve Hogarth. I mean, he's become one of my favorite vocalists. He's so emotive. When you see him live, he gets so into his character, I'll say, depending on the song. I'm thinking of things like Invisible Man and things like that. He just dives his entire persona into this stuff. And you can hear him do it in the studio too. And it started with this album. I mean, he really gives his all. And I've just been a big fan of his voice ever since. And he brought a lot to the band. He wasn't just a singer. He was an experienced lyricist. He was in a couple of the bands. So eventually the third party lyric help went away. But I think when you bring all this together and you come back to what the question is for tonight, yes, it is a very close one. Fish went off and made a great album that sounds nothing like Marillion. But you also had a band that had a legacy that could have totally shit the bed with a new singer. They could have gotten some goofball that couldn't sing or was too much of a clown or whatever. They've had the perfect fit and then some, in my opinion. And from what they did later, you get to things like Brave and Marbles and things like that. They became, in my opinion, a bigger band. I know they were big in the 80s with Fish, but I think they got even bigger. The breadth of their fan base expanded, as you see with all the crowdfunding and all that kind of thing. So for me, I'm also going to give the edge to Season's End, and that is not a knock on Vigil. Vigil's a great album. I was really happy to go back and listen to it 3 or 4 times in the last few days. It's a really great album. But if I need to pick one up and throw it in headphones, I got to give the nod to Season's End. And add on the B-sides of the release and the Bell in the Sea, which I absolutely love, puts it over the top.
Cool. Well said. All right, Chuck.
Man, once again, good evening, guys. A little, thinking about this over here. My way that I discovered Marillion was through the single Incommunicado, which they did play briefly here in New York City. They played it very briefly. And I remember getting into music books, buying some music books like the All Music Guide and other books that from England, and they were talking about Marillion. And I remember the song, but they had mentioned how the song Kaylee actually was a minor hit here. They're actually their only minor hit in this country, in the US. And I was like, I remember that song. And I also remember Lavender as well. They both got some airplay here in New York City,
Yep.
but then they just went by the wayside afterwards. What's it? I wound up purchasing Fugazi, scripts from a Jester's Tear, and I also purchased Misplaced Childhood, and also the last album with Clutching at Straws. I have all those on vinyl, and I remember listening to those albums ad nauseum. But like a lot of people in the United States, I didn't get into Marillion. Like I never got to see them. You know, I actually bought Season's End, what's the day that it was released here in New York City, in the United States. And I remember listening to this album, what's it, and being floored by the King of the Sunset Town. I'm like, that's a perfect way to start off an album. I'm like, that's damn pretty good. And then The Beautiful Easter, what's it? That's a song that they played on our classic rock station during the evening. And I happened to catch it one day, and I was like, oh, that's still Marillion. The uninvited guest is untypical of Marillion before then. It's a nice song, but Season's End, the title track is just an immense song, just very emotional. Then you have then you start off the second side, which is Holloway Girl in Berlin, After Me, which is a beautiful song, which is on my cassette. It wasn't on the album. And then you have Hooks in You, and then The Space. Always liked the way this album was. What's it that I had being that I was just getting into Marillion at the time. To hear H wasn't as jarring as it was to most fans that were fans of Marillion when Fish was there. And then I wanted to get the new Fish album that came out, which was a few months later, Vigil of the Wilderness. And when I first heard this album, it was nothing like Marillion beforehand. Got to listen to the very first song, Vigil, beautiful song. Then the second song is the Big Wedge, and I was like, wow, this is kind of different. Wasn't expecting this song. I thought this was like a Phil Collins song. Forgive me for saying this, but but I still loved it. And then State of Mind. But the songs that really catch me on here on this album, The Company, beautiful soft song. Actually not soft song. It's basically him pouring out his heart about the time that he was with Marillion. And then A Gentleman's Excuse Me, beautiful song. That's always been one of my favorite songs from Fish. And then then you have the other songs on the album, The Voyeur, Family Business, A View from the Hill. But Cliche probably might be my favorite Fish song. It's a song that I listen to all the time. I remember basically just continuously putting that song back on because it was the most Marillion sounding of all the songs on his debut album. Just love that song. Jack and Jill's a beautiful song, and Internal Exile. But then I also have the version that has demo versions, Whiplash, and then also I also love the Alex Harvey Faith Healer version, which is a cover that he did, and also Punching Judy, which is a song that I always know that he loved singing. Gone was all the stuff from the Jester, but you still hear that it's Fish because you get to hear him emotively speaking and writing these beautiful lyrics and singing very well on this album. Like everybody else, this was very tough because, when I first heard Season's End, I loved it from the beginning. But when I heard Vigils in the Wilderness, I just absolutely fell in love with this album. And I was just kind of saddened that as great as this album was, and so that in comparison to Season's End, Season's End seemed to be a bit more focused from a band that knew what they were doing with the band music that they were writing. despite having a brand new singer, who wrote some of the lyrics on this album, along with, if I'm not mistaken, John Helmer. And when it comes to, there was a bit more diversity on Vigil in the Wilderness of the Mirrors, but if I had to pick between these two, because I've listened to both ad nauseum, but I think I'm going to go slightly more. I'm probably going to go in the opposite direction. I think I'm going to go with Fish instead, because I really love this album, and I think that the album, despite its diversity, seems to speak more to my heart because I love Fish's lyrics. So I'm going to be the odd man out, and I'm going to pick Fish's Vigil in the Wilderness of the Mirrors as my pick for this one between the two.
Cool. Chuck, incidentally, Cliche is the only song from this album that he played at Nearfest in 2008.
Incredible. It's such a great album. He could have played Vigil, but I wish that he'd have played the Big Wedge, but what's it? I guess that I guess that's all he wanted to play. But he didn't even play Internal Exile, which I was surprised at.
It's interesting you mentioning Internal Exile, because when I saw him before the debut album came out, he was playing that at that stage, but it's not on the initial versions.
No,
that album.
No,
it's. I mean, there's a lyrical idea on that is, I think it's at Tic Tac Toe. I can't quite remember. That is already. I think it is. Anyway, it doesn't matter what it's called. There's already there.
Exile on Princess Street.
Yes, thank you. That's already there at that stage. So that was an idea that would be kicking about for 3 or 4 years before you actually put out a recorded version. So it's funny how that song kind of took so long to get from where it was to where it finished. But you also mentioned in Faith Healer, that's what you opened the set with. And I mean, we were a bit confused at the time, but I suppose, do you want to open your set with a song of your own that nobody knows?
Or a cover that everybody's going to love.
Absolutely. Do you want to go out there and open with a Marillion song and everyone goes, hey, that's what we're here for? So actually, it was a really clever way to open the set, was to go, especially up in Scotland, because, Alex Harvey Band were a Scottish-based band, to come out with something that everybody knew, that was a great song with great energy, but it didn't kind of split you into, oh, we don't know that, or, well, this is really why we came.
They used to play a lot of Alex Harvey here in New York City, but when the classic rock station was still great. And I remember that song. I still love that song, Faith Healer. But anyway, sorry, forgive me.
Great song. Cool. Yeah, I mean, there's no winners or losers here. Both of them, I think we all can agree both of these albums are terrific, but it's kind of cool to hear everybody talk about them, because I think they mean a lot to anybody who's a fan, a Marillion fan. So, Lewis, what do you got to say about these two gems?
Okay. A lot has been said already. What I will say, which is different, is that one of the things that I didn't like about Season's End is that they had a lyricist. And one of the strongest suits of Marillion was the fact that Fish was the lyricist. And I've never liked it when a band has to hire external people to write for them.
Well, they did bring him in before Hogarth joined.
Yeah,
I understand, but he became, well, Fish is certainly gone, and with him was his edge as a lyricist, in my opinion. So I didn't like that. I don't know much about John Helmer. As I prepared for this show, I read that he was in a band called the Piranhas, a ska band, ska punk. And then he moved on to something else. And then he's been doing, he seems like a very interesting guy, mostly a writer, obviously. And, but I didn't know anything about him. And I just thought it was weird that these guys needed somebody. The thing with the end is that the songs that I love are almost perfect. The songs that I don't love, I really don't like. Hooks in You is a terrible song, in my opinion. It's really terrible. And Uninvited Guest, talk about an aptly titled song for an album. I just don't care for those two songs. So, that was a song that nobody's really talked about. You, which I think is one of the greatest love songs, and the song is about insisting and trying to be innocent. I absolutely love that song. So it's a great record. On the other, Wilderness, Vigil and Wilderness of Mirrors is a record which I love lyrically. I love the opener. I love Big Wedge. I love the lyrics. I love what he's doing with the music. The problem is that it's not really a band. And it's certainly not a band as good as Marillion. It's a bunch of different guys doing different things. And the only common denominator is Fish. So from that perspective, I think he deserves a lot of credit because there is a continuity to the sound. But on the other, you can't really compete with the musicians in Marillion because they're just so well integrated. When you think about things like the space, and by the way, the lyrics in the good songs are also great for Marillion. The thing with the space, with the tram in Amsterdam that just knocks that car, and the way that Hogarth likes to say that, I think I've often been the tram, but also I've been the car. I like that a lot about him, and so it was a very difficult choice. As usual, Pardo is a masochistic and also sadist person. He gives these assignments that are so hard. And
well, come on, we got to blame this guy down below.
This one's Eric's fault.
You run the show.
I know. I know.
So
I could have told him no, we're not doing that, right?
That's right, but it was cool. So it was a very hard choice for me. I think in the end, by the finest of margins, I'm gonna go with Vigil, only because it doesn't have Hooks in You. And I really, really, really fucking hate that song. So, and I can't say that about any of the songs in Vigil. Therefore, but the peaks of Seasons are higher.
Luis,
But that minus is really, it's like a splinter in my brain.
Luis, let me pose this to you. If Hooks and You and Uninvited Guest were replaced by The Release and Bell in the Sea, would that change your answer?
Oh, I mean, if my grandmother had wheels, she'd be a bicycle. But that's not the point. The point is we were judging the record we got. So
I understand that. I'm giving you a hypothetical, and you're talking about.
I mean, in the hypothetical world, I would say, yeah, if you gave me two really good songs instead of two really shitty ones, that's the winner. But I mean, also I could start guessing what might have happened if Fish had actually assembled a band and had not necessarily listened to the Suits and had done something a little bit different. So I don't know how to gauge that. But you are right. The Bell in the Sea is just a beautiful song, right?
Great song.
I will give you this. If you only switch out one of those two bad ones, Seasons End wins, right? But as it stands, I have to give it to Fish.
I think there's two things from that. I would suggest that initially what Fish put together was meant to be a band. Most of those guys play on most of those songs. Mm-hmm. There's only really State of Mind where there's a real kind of switch in and out. Mark Berzicki, or how you pronounce it, apologies.
Yeah, the drummer, yeah.
Plays drums on most of the album. You know, Frank Usher's there through most of the album. Mickey Simmons is there through all of the album. It was meant to be a band, but as seemed to be a common theme with Fish in the solo terms, he couldn't keep it together because financially he couldn't run the show in between times. So everyone thought, well, I have to earn a living.
Yeah,
I'm going to go and do something else. So, I mean, Mickey Simmons still writes an awful lot of what comes next on the second album, but it doesn't feel like it, to be fair. That feels like a very different entity entirely. Yeah. The other thing that's interesting that I've really only thought about as we've kind of come to do this show is Hooks and You is a bit of an anomaly. Doesn't fit stylistically on the
No.
album at all.
Even
The
mentioned.
uninvited guest, I personally, and there's a lot of love out there for it in the Marillion community, so I'm out on a limb here. It's not one of my favourite songs. Live, still not one of my favourite songs. You do wonder if somebody from the record company went, yeah, but guys, where's the single?
Oh, yeah.
And
I think that's
why we ended
100%
up with,
true.
yeah, with those two songs on there that don't really represent what's going on? And as you say, Chad, the B-sides do. The B-sides represent the album sound and the atmosphere better. And it took them to get to Brave, and admittedly that took them off the label entirely, but it took them to get to Brave for them to kind of go, you know what, we're just going to write the album that we want. Because Holidays in Eden is a complete compromise. I like it, but it's a complete compromise.
I had to grow into that.
Yeah.
To that
Yeah.
album. That's the only. That's one of the. I'm sorry.
No, go ahead.
No, it's one of
ahead.
two tours that I saw Marillion. I saw Marillion for the Holidays in Eden, and I also saw them for Fear, FEAR as well. And they were absolutely mind-kicking brilliant on both of them. Superb, man. Mhm.
Yeah.
That's
Every
one
time
of
I've
the-
seen them,
Were you
they've
at that
been
Irving
great.
Plaza show, Chuck?
Irving Plaza, which one? The
I think
yeah,
that was the holidays tour. I
Yeah,
saw.
that was the holiday. That's the
Yeah,
only. That was the first time that I saw them. Mhm.
Yeah, I was at that. I was at that show.
Yeah, because I was at that show. Mhm.
I haven't seen them since Marbles, but that was an unbelievable show.
I didn't see them.
I saw him on
Marvelous.
that tour also. Yeah.
Yeah, I'm
Yeah.
about to make myself unpopular with Marillion fans here and say, I mean, I've seen the band consistently through the years. I think they have grown to be. I never saw them a Fish. That's one of my great regrets because I could have gone to Clutch and tour and decided not to because I'll see them next time. But anyway, I think that they are a far better live band now than they were previously. They've grown into being something. I think for a lot of people that don't get what they do with H, if you see them live and you still don't get it, yeah, okay, I'm fine with that. Do you know, but that is where it clicks. That's where it really happens. They are ridiculously good live. Unbelievable.
All right.
One thing that I did not mention, but I just want to say quickly is that I kind of like the fact that until the next album, The Rake's Progress, because they did what they did, and I think maybe I don't mind it, but I think but you negotiate. But the anger was not really entirely matched by the music and the arrangements. I think that the album should have been a little bit darker, should have been a little bit more a different instrumentation, perhaps here and there, just differently produced. It would have been a different, Clutching at Straws. That's such a brilliant album, and that has a perfect balance. Just suffers, even though I prefer it. I wonder what would have been.
Yeah, Lewis, we're missing a lot of what you're saying. I guess your connection is kind of
Yeah.
small. Oh, now he's frozen.
Well, that's
All right. Well.
okay.
Doing the best he can.
He's making some great points that we can't hear.
I know. I'm like hanging on every word. I'm like, what was that?
Yeah, like, oh man.
If I could hear you, I would definitely agree.
Actually, what he's really trying to say, he loves that Marillion song that sounds like Docket. Yes. Hey.
Oh man.
All right, Eric, what do you have to say about these two fine albums?
Well, I got to say kudos to everybody because I've really enjoyed listening to your stories. You guys have covered everything. So I know Chad said ditto after Steven, but I could pretty much say ditto and just say which one I like the best. But I enjoyed hearing how each of one of you got into Marillion. And I think mine relates mostly to Steven. I was a fan in 85. I was in a band out of high school, and the guy that was our bass player singer, he was a prog head. He was the guy who introduced me to progressive music. So like Steven said, I got into Marillion and they were happening. Kaylee and Lavender were out. They were a band, Yes had already come and gone and were in their second whatever incarnation with 901. I mean, all those bands were in their prime in the 70s, but I loved them at that point. Marillion was a band that I could say, these guys are happening now. And I loved Fish. I loved Marillion. I loved everything they did. The only thing I always struggled with, and this has nothing to do with the topic, but I always struggled with script because the Mick Pointer's drumming always drove me insane. That album drags to me, and Mosley made a huge difference to this band. But Steven just took the one thing that I thought I could say that he covered. I was in college in 87 and they came and played the Palace in Albany. And my drummer called me and said, hey, Marillion's playing the Palace. I'm like, I'm 4 hours away. And I didn't go to the show thinking just like Steven did, I'll catch him on the next tour. And Fish is gone. And the internet, so was it very early stages of the internet. So I didn't see Steve Hogarth, didn't know what he looked like. Fish was gone. This was my band at this time. I loved these guys. But I did the same thing. We went out, we got this the day it was released, went back to our bass player's house, listened to it. I don't know if you guys had Strawberries Records down where Pete is and Chuck. That's where I remember where I bought this album. And I remember hearing King of Sunset Town. It was like an explosion. It was like they were free. And I'm not judging. I'm just saying that song absolutely blew me away. And I'm like, they're good. They're set. This guy can sing. He's a great singer. And like you guys said, Easter follows it up. It's fantastic. Are there a couple songs? But I mean, you could look at Kaylee and say, oh, that's a pop song. So I get why Hooks and You is in there. And I get why Uninvited Guest is in there. They're trying to keep that momentum going. And now they lost their singer. And at least in this market, you never heard them again, right? I mean, did they get any radio play? I think MTV played them a little bit, but and I saw this tour as well. I saw them at Saratoga Winters, which was a metal club. Not suited for them at all. It was a tiny club, but they were fantastic. And it was the first time I remember seeing Steve Hogarth, and I thought he was great. I hadn't seen them with Fish, but you can't deny the guy's a great singer. Like everyone has said, there might be a bump or two on the road on this album, but overall, I love this album. Start to finish, great stuff. Berlin, Holloway Girl, like you guys have said, those are awesome. The Space. Now with Fish, I've never seen him. And when this came out, I'll admit, and I'm not a lyrics guy, I'm there for the music. I was a little, I don't want to say disappointed, but to me, it was a little below Season's End, but I loved Vigil. Gentlemen's Excuse Me, I think is a beautiful song, but I kept listening to it. And then going back to this, if I was to say, which one do I listen to more? Season's End has definitely been played more in my house than Vigil. But I grew to like that. Vigil took me a while to get into, whereas I think Season's End, for the most part, I was good. And that's kind of odd when you replace somebody as like Fish. I mean, Fish was their personality. As great a band as they are, as great as their music is, Fish was the man, right? And Hogarth did not take me any bit of time to get used to. I fell in love with him right out of the gate. And I just as a nod to my buddy George, who always talks about Rate Your Music, he got me into Rate Your Music. I went out and looked at these two, and Vigil is a 3.67 out of 5, and Season's End is a 3.68. So it doesn't get much closer than that. So I think we've all been pretty much on the mark with these two albums. And kudos to both of them. I mean, both of them could have gone off a cliff. You've lost your main guy, and you've lost your band. And I think they both came out and proved themselves. And obviously both of them have had lengthy careers. So how do you argue with that? You know, favorite, least favorite, I think you said it, Pete. They're both excellent albums. And at that point, to me, it just comes down to a little bit of preference. And I probably went more to the Marillion camp than Fish. So.
The Vigil actually charted at number 5.
Yeah.
And Season's End was 7, right, Stephen?
Yeah, that surprised me when I went back and
Yeah.
looked at this, because Marillion still seemed to have, for this album and Holidays, they seem to have still quite a high profile here in the UK. You could see, I mean, we didn't get video channels in quite the same way at this point, but you could see their videos on TV. You knew who they were getting radio play. I don't remember that for Fish, but Big Wedge charted at number 25 in the singles chart, which was the highest out of any of the singles that came off either album. And yet, as you say, Vigil went up to number 5 in the UK charts, and that's really quite a feat when you look at what happened next, because in the nicest possible way, they both fell away very quickly in those terms, you know, commercial success. And yet the music landscape changed, obviously, as we went into the 90s. But Marillion had a profile that was large enough that you thought they might be able to ride that out. And if anything, the opposite was true for both them and Fish. And they kind of lost away a little bit for a while before both coming back really, really strong. So it's an interesting journey, but yeah, I just don't remember Vigil having that impact over here. It really did. Do you know, Fish wasn't playing big venues. So it's interesting looking back, because I don't remember that, and I was a fan.
Yeah, something that Eric was just saying before kind of really sparked something in me. You know, I was becoming a pretty big Marillion fan when they broke up. Well, when Fish left. So for me, this was kind of like the Black Sabbath thing all over again. It's like, you know, the late 70s. I'm just starting to get into Black Sabbath. They're the greatest thing I've ever heard in my life. And then I'm like, Ozzy's not in the band anymore. Who's this Dio guy, right? And so I had to like kind of rediscover the band and realize, oh yeah, Dio, he's the Rainbow guy. Oh, this album's great. It's different, but it's great. And I had the almost exact same experience with Marillion. It's like I'm starting to get into this band, and I remember buying Misplaced Childhood and Clutching and thinking, this is great. Oh, he's gone. It's like, what? Here we go again. And what's really interesting is that they both went off, Fish on his own, Marillion with a new singer, and they both did albums and continue to do albums that really don't sound anything like the albums they did together. And maybe that's for the best. You know, obviously Fish is the voice and, you know, the lyrics and whatnot, but I would argue that Vigil is one of his strongest vocal performances, maybe throughout much of his catalog. I mean, he sounds great on Vigil, I think. But so let's break him down a little bit. So in saying what I just said, so obviously when the split happened, I went to Team Fish immediately. I was like, because he was my guy. You know, to me, the band was as great as they were, and he had a lot to do with that. And I don't normally take sides with vocalists. Usually for me, as most people know, it's like I'm all about the guitar player, right? So I should have been all about Hogarth and said, okay, Fish, we love you, you're gone, but you know, I'm all in on Team M here. And it didn't quite work out that way. I kind of, when Fish left, I was like, I made a decision that I'm going to follow him a little bit more closely. I still bought all the Marillion stuff, but I did not jump on the H bandwagon for a couple of years at least. I liked him. I thought he was really good, but I automatically had the thought process that I'm going to probably like these Fish albums more, and I kind of forced myself into that, which is kind of weird. I love this album. I think it's kind of wonderfully woven. There's some really interesting kind of like Celtic, folky, poppy, rock stuff on here. It's not a prog album, although there are, you know, the title track and Cliche is gorgeous. Guys love it. Big Wedge is a fun, big anthemic rocker. I love State of Mind. I love The Company. A lot of the vocal harmonies on here are just amazing. And I've been listening to both these albums this week, and I haven't listened to this in a while, and I was kind of surprised at how well it still stands up. It's really, really good. Every song on here I like. There's nothing I don't like on here. Love the artwork. It feels Marillion-y, right? I mean, everything about it just screams like a continuation of what he was doing with the band. Good musicianship on here. Again, to Lewis's point, I don't think it really feels like a band, but it doesn't matter because it's Fish to me. So it feels like a fully realized album, and I love that about it. Now this, I think there are some songs on here that I like better than anything on Vigil. King of Sunset Town is great. I love Easter. It's a top 10 Marillion song. I don't care who's singing. Just absolutely love it. And the second half of the song gets me every time.
Yep.
I mean, come on. I mean, how can you not get into it, right? It's so amazing. And to see him play it live is great. I like The Uninvited Guest. I think it's a good rocker. Holloway Girl is great. Berlin is just so atmospheric and dreamy. Love it. After Me is a nice little pop song. Obviously, I haven't mentioned one song yet because I think it's the best song on this album. It's a title track. Title track moves me big time. Big time. I don't mind Hoaxing You. It's silly. It's not really Marillion sounding. I think the guitar riff is pretty cool. That's really what I like about it. But it's a great album. Come on, Lewis. It's a cool guitar riff. It's not what you want to hear Rotary playing.
I'm with you, Pete. I don't dislike the song. It just doesn't fit.
It just doesn't.
No, I hear you. It's very different. So, would this album be stronger without it? Sure, but I don't hate it. So, I mean, the question for me, it's like, so to me, these are both, they're 4.5, 5-star albums out of 5, both of them.
Yep.
And interestingly enough, if we would have had this conversation 25 years ago, maybe 30 years ago, I would have easily said this. Today, it's a lot closer. It's very difficult. And I've changed my mind 3-4 times today. And you know what? When it all comes down to it, I have to stop and think, well, which album has the songs that move me the most? And today, that's this one. It's really close. I normally am a Fish guy. I mean, people have heard me talk on this channel for a long time about how I generally prefer Fish era albums to H albums. And I, talk very highly about the Fish solo catalog, but this to me, it's still my favorite Hogarth era album. And it's really special. There's just some, and I like a lot of the other albums. I have gone back and revisited a lot of them in recent years because I've kind of shit on them quite a bit. I have, Stephen will know, I've said statements like I find, Marillion of the last 20 years boring and lifeless and kind of and all those things. I'm kind of changing my tune on that. There's still a couple albums I don't really like too much when they were kind of doing that late 90s, early 2000s kind of grungy stuff or whatever you want to call it.
Marillion.com.
Yeah, oof, that's bad.
Radiation.
Yeah, oof, no good. But their last handful of albums, really strong. This just stuff has been really strong. But again, back to these, they're both excellent. And you know what? They split, and I don't think either camp looked back, and they shouldn't have to. We've got the early catalog, which we'll all love forever. But you know what? Solo and Marillion going forward with Hogarth, we're all winners to have both of them, right?
Yeah, you know what? Those special editions they've been putting out that have the band, the current band sitting with Fish talking about those albums, them in the same room, is really, really cool.
Yeah, it's very cool, isn't it? Yep.
A lot of wounds that were healed after all that time.
Yep.
This is my number 3. I still have 2 or more albums that I love a bit more than this one, but this album once again just continues to always clutch at my straws, man. Clutch at my heart.
It's interesting because
isn't it true that Fish had a radio program for a while? And he used to play the song Easter.
Yeah, that he did. It was called Fish on Fridays.
He used to play Easter.
Yeah. That he did, yeah. I mean,
Yeah,
they
liked that
patched
song
things up.
for good reasons.
Yeah,
Yeah.
they've patched things up in recent years,
Mhm.
and thankfully, so he turned up at a Marillion gig that I was at the Glasgow ABC a few years back. It's quite a few years back now, in actual fact. And there was just that murmur that went round the room. Fish is in the house, but he went up the stairs to the bit at the back that we weren't allowed in. But everyone knew that he was there, kind of thing. So that is a good thing.
6'7".
Yeah, absolutely. But it's interesting. I wish I started reading it a bit earlier, but yesterday I started reading Mark Kelly's new autobiography. I'm only about 20 pages in because it's been a busy couple of days, but it's going to be a good read. But he opens it with, so I'm not spoiling it for anybody because this is right at the start of the book, about being approached in 2015 out of the blue to do a tour with Fish and get back together for very much of this, obviously. And he goes into the reasons why it didn't happen. And I am so pleased that it didn't. I mean, I never saw them together. And that's a real regret of mine. It's one of the few kind of gigs I think, oh man, could have but didn't. But I don't want to hear it now. I would have wanted to hear it then. I don't want to hear it now because the legacy and what they've done apart, I think, is just as impressive and important as the 4 albums that they did together. And I think it would cheapen it. So I'm really glad that for whatever the reasons were, and he touches on them in the book, and I won't spoil that bit, that he didn't even approach the rest of the band with it. He just went, no. How about we play the Royal Albert Hall instead? And that worked out okay for them too. So
I would think Fish probably would have a difficult time singing a lot of those classic.
Yeah. You know, Stephen, you should speak to a lot of old Genesis fans and give them the same lecture. Just replace Genesis and Peter, Gabriel with Fish and Marillion, because it is one of the most annoying things in the universe to keep hearing this over and over and over. And even though they have now retired, even now poor Phil Collins now looks like Timmy from South Park, they are still talking about it. And it just breaks my heart. I don't understand it. I agree with you completely. It would be cheapening the legacy. It would be a vulgar cash.
Yeah, it would have been nice to see 20 or 25 years ago.
30 years ago.
It's not happening. Yeah.
Nope.
Yeah. Peter Gabriel has no interest whatsoever.
No, thank goodness.
And quite rightly so, for a variety of different reasons.
Yeah. I'm quite happy having Steve Hackett go out and do his Genesis Revisited thing tour after the tour, right? I mean,
same again. It's the best of both worlds, isn't it?
Yep.
So,
and he's doing a great job, man.
Yep. So, all right, cool. Well, that was a great conversation, and 2 fantastic albums. Like I said, there's no losers here. Who did it better? They both did it great. That's all that counts, right? So for everybody watching, let us know your thoughts about these 2 fine albums, Seasoned End by Marillion and Vigil in a Wilderness of Mirrors by Fish. Both released the first albums after they decided to go separate ways. 2 great ones. If you haven't heard either one or both of them, your assignment is to go out and listen to them and come back into the comments section and let us know what you think, right? That's what it's all about. And if you know them both well, give us a little bit of love for both of them. Let us know what you think. So I want to thank the guys for re-listening to these albums over the last week or 2, or however long it's been since we said this was a go. We're going to revisit this theme again in 2 weeks with Genesis. So we're going to take a look at the first album after the split. So it's the first self-titled Peter Gabriel album, the Car album, and the Genesis album, of course, is Trick of the Tail. So that'll be in 2 weeks. Next week, we're going to be switching gears just a little bit. We're going to be doing favorite krautrock albums. So we've got some folks from this panel who will be here, some that won't. Ken Golden will be in the house. Steve Feigenbaum will be in the house.
Oh.
So so that should be a fun show next week. So stay tuned for that. And visit us on the web at www.seatranquility.org. We're on Facebook. We're on YouTube. All together.
All the damn time.
Even all the damn time from Mexico, right? See that? We got Mexico, Scotland, New York, Pennsylvania. We are like all over creation. So thanks for watching, everybody. Please hit that subscribe button if you haven't already, and click on that notification bell so you get alerted of all of our content as it posts. For Eric Porter, Louis Nasser, Chad Hutchinson, Chuck Alvarez, and Stephen Reed, I am Pete Pardo. Good night, everybody. See you next week for some krautrock here on In the Prog Seat. Take care. Bye-bye.
Good night.
Good night.